The Coca-Cola hit her with the kind of cold that felt personal, sticky and sharp, splashing straight across her blouse, down her collar, and seeping into the waistband of her slacks like an insult that had waited its turn. It wasn't a spill, it was a throw. Intentional, public, deliberate. And when Ava Langston blinked against the sting, not from the soda but from the moment itself, the room erupted, bright, modern, filled with polished smiles and rising star resumes, erupted into laughter. The young man holding the empty cup, his wrist still extended in theatrical flourish, grinned wide, the kind of grin that didn't expect consequences. He had the slick hair of someone who'd never known rejection, the posture of someone who always sat front row, always first pick. His name tag read Trevor Hale, and if he'd looked close enough, he might have noticed the stillness in Ava's eyes before he spoke, but he didn't. Instead, he lifted his voice above the laughter and said, "Oops, thought you were janitorial." Then, like it was a joke everyone had been in on, he turned and let out a soft chuckle. Casual, cruel, forgettable. Ava didn't flinch. She didn't wipe her face or glance down at the fabric now clinging to her skin, turning translucent under the fluorescent lights. She simply stood, still, the weight of silence clinging to her far more tightly than the soda. Her hands, folded gently at her front, did not tremble. Her badge, a simple rectangle of laminated plastic labeled trainee, swayed slightly with the movement of the crowd that surged with delight at her expense, and in that moment, sharp, sticky, unbearable, she became invisible in plain sight. Behind her, someone whispered, "She looks like she just crawled out of the basement." A woman's voice, pitched high with delight. Somewhere near the reception desk, a phone camera clicked. Someone else muttered, "Diversity hire, probably." And then the laughter crested again, bold now, confident, as if her silence gave permission. The lobby of Pendrix Systems shimmered with afternoon light filtered through glass walls and stainless steel, the skyline of Atlanta rising like judgment behind it. Ava could see her own reflection in the polished surface of the elevator doors. Her blouse soaked through, her dark hair, once pulled into a neat bun, now slick and dripping against her neck. She looked, to them, like someone lost, like someone misplaced. And in a way, that was true. She didn't belong there. Not in their assumptions, not in their hierarchy. Trevor's voice came again, lower this time, but aimed directly at her. "Didn't mean to ruin your thrift store look." Then, louder to the others, "She'll dry off, they always do." And he laughed again, adjusting the cuff of his designer blazer as though that last line had earned him applause. Ava's jaw shifted. Not much, just enough for those watching closely to feel a quiet shift in the air, like the first crack of thunder you think might have been imagined. But she still didn't speak. Not then. Esther Rowe, standing at the far end of the lobby, near the etched glass wall bearing the company's mission statement, didn't laugh. She didn't smile, or shift uncomfortably. She simply watched. Her gray bob cut neat, and her eyes sharper than the light bouncing off the floor. She'd seen many things in her 37 years at Pendrix Systems, but this was not just another office humiliation. She saw something else. Something just beneath the surface. She folded her arms, her lips pressed thin, and watched the room laugh itself dry. No one else noticed the janitor pause in the hallway, the mop handle slipping slightly in his hand. Or the intern Malik, barely 20, who turned his phone over, screen down, as if ashamed of what he'd just recorded. No one noticed the mailroom clerk frown as she wheeled her cart of packages past the circle of laughter, her eyes on Ava like a silent apology. But Ava saw them. She saw all of them. Not with anger, not with vengeance, but with a kind of knowing that ran deeper than pride. A knowing born from decades of walking through rooms where she wasn't expected, wearing names that made others uncomfortable, carrying silence like a shield. She reached for her bag, the canvas strap now damp where soda had splashed, and still, she didn't speak. She just walked. Past Trevor. Past the interns giggling near the snack bar. Past Lindsay Sharp with her crimson lipstick and cruelly arched brow, who'd filmed the entire moment from the corner, whispering viral gold into her phone. The elevator dinged, empty. Ava stepped in, alone, her fingers brushing the panel. She didn't press the floor number. Not yet. She let the doors close first, shutting out the laughter, the whispers, the heat of humiliation rising on her skin, and only then did she exhale, long and low. The breath of someone who had chosen silence not because she had no words, but because she knew the power of using them later. Because sometimes, when the room is laughing the loudest, the most dangerous person is the one who's still. Pendrix Systems didn't feel like a place that welcomed mystery. It was a tower of clarity, glass panels, clean desks, minimalist art that never quite said anything, only hinted at value. Located in Midtown Atlanta, the headquarters stretched 22 floors into a skyline built by ambition and polished by legacy. It was the kind of place where even the hallways smelled expensive, where elevators whispered instead of dinging, where job titles mattered and shoes told stories before names did. In that world, Ava Langston, hair damp, blouse still tinged with cola, badge swinging low on her hip, was an enigma no one had time to solve. She didn't wear power the way most did there, no sharp heels or designer-wrapped dresses, no watch heavy with logo, no jargon-laced greetings designed to impress. Her presence was quiet, unpolished, but held a weight that was hard to name. Her slacks, slightly too loose, hung from her frame like they'd been chosen for comfort, not presentation. Her shoes were flat, soft-soled, worn at the edges, and yet, as she moved through the office that morning, the carpet beneath her softened, as if, despite everything, the place made room. Her badge read trainee, printed in simple black font. No title, no department, just her name, Ava Langston. Unassuming, common even if one didn't know where to look, and no one here looked beyond the surface. Not in a building like this, where youth was polished and middle age was tolerated only if it brought enough revenue. She'd chosen it that way. She had stepped into this world under a name trimmed of lineage, under a title stripped of rank, under silence willingly worn. It was her decision. Her husband had raised an eyebrow when she told him. "You know they won't see you," Isaiah had said gently, his voice more statement than warning. Ava had smiled, her voice even softer. That's the point. The truth, of course, was deeper than any of them knew. Ava Langston Pendrix wasn't a trainee. She wasn't even an employee, technically. She was the incoming chairwoman of Pendrix Systems, appointed quietly by the board and the European parent company after a year of negotiations and soul-searching. Her husband, Isaiah Pendrix, had built the original infrastructure during the tech boom of the late 90s and sold it just before the crash, keeping enough equity to remain both relevant and invisible. Now, decades later, they had agreed Pendrix needed reform. And Ava was the scalpel, not the hammer. What no one knew, not even Esther Rowe, was that Ava had spent the last 6 months studying the company from a distance. She'd read every personnel file, traced every policy decision, followed the trails of who spoke up, who looked away, and who did the quiet harm. Her decision to walk into that lobby with a plain blouse and a badge marked trainee was not a disguise. It was a test. And now she had names. At 61, Ava did not feel the need to command rooms with force. She had seen what force became over time, how it aged into brittle authority, how it demanded louder voices to stay relevant. She believed in stillness, in the power of observing a person when they thought you were unimportant. That morning, in the elevator's reflective glass, she'd seen more than soda on her skin. She'd seen clarity. Pendrix Systems thrived on hierarchy. The higher the title, the smaller the coffee cup. The larger the office, the quieter the tone. Ava had watched it all in motion. Junior associates orbiting directors like planets, interns timing their jokes to earn approving laughs, women adjusting their laughter to be just the right pitch of agreeable. The entire company was a performance. Some brilliant, most exhausting. She didn't come to play a part. She came to listen. Trevor Hale, the intern who had thrown the drink, was the son of a longtime investor. His resume had arrived pre-approved. He played golf with 2 junior VPs, called the CEO by his first name in passing, and wore his surname like a shield. Ava had watched his file for weeks. It was thin on substance but thick with recommendations. Today he'd written himself into a different file. And then there was Esther Rowe, the one outlier in the polished sea. A woman in her late 60s, with a silver bob that refused trend and an expression that didn't care for small talk. She'd been at Pendrix longer than most employees had been alive, long enough to know the politics but too principled to pretend to like them. When she watched Ava that morning, watched her soaked and silent, unmoved by humiliation, there was no pity in her stare, only memory. Esther had seen this before, in boardrooms where women were underestimated, in promotions that never came, in meetings where voices like Ava's were cut off halfway through a sentence. And something in the set of Ava's shoulders told her, this wasn't over, this was the beginning. They didn't just laugh once, they laughed again, and again, as if her presence, soaking, silent, undeniably composed, had become a kind of invitation to mistreatment, as though dignity, when unarmed and unannounced, was some sort of open door for dismissal. It wasn't just the Coke. That was only the introduction. What followed was a symphony of small cruelties, each note played with the confidence of impunity. When Ava stepped toward the main elevator that morning, still damp but upright, a woman with platinum hair and a dress that clung to her ambition like static leaned forward and blocked her way. "Sweetheart," she said, loud enough to draw glances, "this elevator's for staff. Service lifts at the back. Might smell like old coffee and bleach, but you'll feel right at home." Her name was Lindsay Sharp, senior brand strategist, famous for her ruthless pitch meetings and her whispered cruelty. Ava didn't reply. She didn't smirk or scowl or shrink. She simply stepped back, her hand falling away from the elevator button like it had never intended to press it. "I'll take the stairs," she said quietly, and turned. The stairwell door opened with a soft hiss, but the tension in the air stayed sharp and brittle, like glass just before the crack. Later that day, the break room became its own arena. A cluster of marketing associates, young, overconfident, half-suited in trend and half in mimicry, stood by the fridge as Ava entered, seeking nothing more than a paper towel and a quiet moment to breathe. One of them, his tie bright like a warning flare and his voice dripping with glee, leaned against the counter and said, "You know we have a dress code, right? That outfit's giving thrift store clearance rack." His friends chuckled, one of them snapping a photo, the flash catching on the residual dampness on Ava's blouse like it was something to be documented and shared. Ava reached for the towel, her fingers slow, her movements measured. Her gaze lifted, not angry, not pleading, simply firm. "Is that all you've got?" she asked, her voice neither soft nor sharp, but somehow both. The laughter stuttered, unsure. The young man blinked, then looked away. Ava folded the towel, dabbed gently at the collar of her shirt, and walked out. Not a word more. Her silence followed them like a scent they couldn't name, but couldn't forget. By afternoon, even the routine task of retrieving documents became a battleground. Ava walked toward the printer on the executive floor, a handful of budget reports waiting for review. A facilities coordinator, clipboarded, gray-vested, and brimming with middle management indignation, stepped into her path. "You're not authorized to use this printer," he said, pointing at the stack in her hand. "Interns use the basement units. Let's not make this an issue." His voice was practiced, the tone of someone who'd said no too many times to the wrong people and found power only in pettiness. Ava looked at him, quiet. Then, without breaking eye contact, she handed him the top page. "Check the signature," she said softly. He glanced, paused, blinked. The initials at the bottom belonged to the board chair himself, in looping ink. By the time he looked up again, she was already gone, her steps unhurried, her presence unbothered. And still, it did not stop. At a team huddle late that day, while employees gathered to discuss marketing strategy around a table cluttered with half-eaten fruit trays and cold coffee, a senior strategist with gold cufflinks and a voice honed in country clubs pointed at Ava. "Hey, coffee run, girl," he barked, tossing a crumpled $20 bill onto the floor near her feet. "Make yourself useful. Latte, extra foam, go." Laughter rose again, not as strong now, but still sharp enough to cut. Ava didn't pick up the bill. She didn't flinch or sigh or even blink. She looked at him, let the silence stretch like thread pulled taut, and said evenly, "I don't drink coffee." Then turned and walked away, her shoes soft on the carpet, the bill left untouched. Behind her, the strategist's smirk sagged just slightly. They thought they were teaching her her place, but Ava was teaching something else entirely, the slow, weighty lesson of restraint, of not rising to mockery, of being bigger than belittlement. They wouldn't understand it yet, not then, but in time they would feel it, in their silence, in their shifts, in their own unease. The truth was already in motion. The hallway to Conference Room B was unusually quiet, as if the building itself sensed something unspoken shifting beneath its polished surfaces. Ava walked with her usual calm, her bag light at her side, her steps neither hurried nor hesitant. And as she passed the framed portraits of Pendrix founders, faces carved in sepia ambition, one detail stopped her. Not dramatically, not with a gasp, but with the kind of pause that mattered. In the center frame, a photograph most employees barely glanced at, she saw her grandfather, not by blood but by legacy. Dr. Clarence Langston, standing beside Isaiah Pendrix, shaking hands in a shot dated 1982. They had built the foundation of Pendrix together, one with engineering, the other with law, their brilliance threaded into the DNA of the company. She had seen this photograph many times as a child, framed in her parents' study, used as a lesson in dignity, in purpose, in quiet strength. Now it hung here, unnoticed by the new generation, background noise to power lunches and quarterly planning. Ava smiled, not with her mouth, but with her eyes. Further down the hallway, just past the copy room, Esther Rowe waited. She stood, as always, upright, unyielding, composed in a way that made younger staff step lightly around her. Without a word, she handed Ava a thick envelope, cream-colored, with a red wax seal still soft at its edges. "From the chairman," Esther said, her voice low, meant only for ears that understood weight. "For your eyes only." Ava accepted it without blinking. No thanks, no questions. Her fingers brushed the seal, its imprint clear, Langston and Pendrix Holdings. Behind her, a few junior staff looked up from their screens, one of them, a young woman with a bright scarf and too little sleep, paused, her gaze flicking from the envelope to Ava's expression and back again. She didn't say anything, but something shifted in her posture. A small moment, a first stir of recognition. Inside the envelope, neatly typed and tabbed, was the blueprint for organizational restructure. Full authority granted to Ava Langston Pendrix, effective immediately, to audit, assess, and reform the U.S. division. It included access to all personnel records, oversight of internal culture investigations, and discretion to realign executive staffing without prior approval. It was, in every sense, a silent declaration of war against everything that had become rotten under Pendrix's gleaming exterior. Ava closed the folder and slipped it into her bag, her movements precise. Her face betrayed nothing, but the weight in her shoulders settled differently now, not heavy but sure. Later that afternoon, in the back of the break room where she rarely lingered, Malik, the young intern who had quietly turned his phone face down during the earlier incident, approached her with uncertain steps. He held out a plain white towel, not fresh from a dispenser, but washed and folded from the janitorial closet downstairs. "I thought maybe," he began, then stopped. His voice, normally full of nervous energy, was softer now, almost reverent. Ava took the towel and nodded once. "Thank you, Malik," she said. Not a throwaway line, not rote politeness, but a sentence spoken with intention, with memory. Malik nodded back, then stepped away, and though he didn't know why, he felt different. like he'd done something right in a world that punished hesitation. In the hallway leading to HR, a senior analyst passed Ava without acknowledgement, but the assistant following behind him, a quiet woman with orthopedic shoes and a stack of manila folders pressed to her chest, glanced at Ava and offered the faintest nod. Not deference, not apology, just a flicker of shared understanding between women who had walked the long way through buildings like this one. When Ava returned to her desk, a nondescript temporary station near the print room, she found a post-it note stuck to her screen. No name, just 3 words in crisp handwriting. "We see you." She peeled it off, folded it once, and tucked it into her wallet beside a photo of her mother. The resistance had not ended. There were still smirks in the hallway, still whispers in the cafeteria, still eyes that rolled when she walked past. But something had shifted. The first cracks had formed, not in the structure of the company, but in the certainty of those who thought themselves untouchable. They didn't know who she was, not yet, but they were starting to suspect she wasn't who they thought. And that was enough for now. The announcement didn't arrive with fanfare. There were no trumpets, no grand emails, no congratulatory balloons pinned to office cubicles. It came instead in the hush between meetings, in the moment after the projector flickered to life but before the first slide appeared. The kind of pause where truth fits best. The senior leadership meeting had been scheduled weeks in advance, an annual review that usually meant stale pastries, circular praise, and PowerPoint diplomacy. No one expected change. Certainly not from a woman in a plain gray blouse, still slightly crinkled from wear, still unmemorable enough to be overlooked twice in a hallway. Yet there Ava stood, at the far end of the conference table, her bag neatly set beside the chair no one had offered her. Lindsay Sharp, resplendent in a coral suit too bright for her intentions, leaned across her notepad and stage whispered to the executive next to her, "Is she in the wrong room again?" The man didn't reply. His eyes were fixed on Ava, not with recognition, but with unease, the kind that comes when something doesn't fit the story you've rehearsed. And then the door opened. Ethan Miles, CEO of Pendrix Systems, entered the room not with his usual brisk efficiency, but with a deliberateness that unsettled. His suit was as tailored as ever, but his eyes were different, focused, solemn. He looked first at Ava, then at the room, and, when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of gravity that made even the smuggest posture falter. "Before we begin," he said, "I'd like to introduce someone." The air shifted, chairs creaked, pens hovered mid-stroke. "Please welcome," he continued, pausing just long enough to make every breath hold, "our new executive chair of Pendrix Systems, U.S. Division, Ava Langston Pendrix." The room didn't gasp. It stopped. Silence fell with such finality that even the air conditioning seemed to take a breath. Ava didn't move. She didn't adjust her blouse or smooth her slacks or clear her throat. She simply stood, hands resting lightly on the leather chair, her gaze meeting theirs one by one. Lindsay's lips parted, but no sound came. Trevor Hale, seated smugly at the back of the room in a spot he'd claimed through nepotism and bravado, blinked, as if waking up mid-nightmare. His jaw slackened, the memory of Coke still clinging to her like unfinished business. Isaiah had told her years ago that real power was quiet, that it didn't need to announce itself with title or tone. It simply needed to be present, completely, unapologetically, and without negotiation. And in that moment, Ava embodied every word of that wisdom. Ethan continued, his voice even. "Ms. Pendrix will lead the restructuring initiative with full board authority. I advise full cooperation from all departments moving forward." Not a single person moved to applaud. Not out of rudeness, but because the sound had been knocked clean out of them. The same woman they'd mocked, dismissed, ridiculed, had been watching, quietly, intently, with a level of discernment none of them had earned, and now she stood at the helm. Ava nodded once, not for them, but for herself. Then she opened the folder in front of her, the same cream-colored dossier Esther had handed her days ago, and began. She didn't begin with anger. She didn't open with reprimands or accusations. Instead, she spoke of structure, of integrity, of the difference between hierarchy and humanity. Her voice was smooth, deliberate, measured, not unlike the cadence of scripture or of memory passed down between generations. She spoke not just of what had failed, but of what had been forgotten. The original vision of Pendrix, built on innovation and fairness, not posturing and cruelty. And as she spoke, the room shifted again, not physically, but in posture, in temperature, in breath. Executives straightened, hands lowered. Phones were set face down, not because she asked, but because they couldn't look away. Lindsay looked as though she might speak, but chose not to. Trevor stared down at the conference table, his knuckles white against the grain. Neither had words that could rewrite what had already been lived. By the end of the meeting, Ava's presence no longer needed explanation. Her badge still read trainee, but no one dared refer to it, because titles, when wielded poorly, are hollow. But silence, when rooted in purpose, carries the weight of justice. She didn't gloat. She didn't mention the Coke. She didn't return the insults they'd hurled. She simply continued, as if none of it surprised her. Because truly, none of it had. The power to punish had been handed to her in full, signed, sealed, endorsed by the board. But Ava Langston Pendrix wielded it the way her mother had taught her, not as a weapon, but as a mirror. She did not fire anyone on the spot, did not summon HR with swift vengeance, did not parade names or call for public apologies. She let silence do the reckoning. The first to fall was not the loudest but the most careless. Lindsay Sharp, once vibrant with mockery, found herself called into a closed-door meeting, not by Ava, but by an external investigator appointed weeks earlier. The footage of her filming Ava's humiliation, laced with commentary, her voice unmistakable, had circulated through internal compliance. She was not dismissed by Ava's hand, but by a system she had believed would never see her. A system she had believed would never see her. The day her badge was deactivated, she walked past Ava in the lobby. Ava said nothing. She simply met her eyes, steady, unflinching. And Lindsay turned her face away, unable to sustain the weight of unspoken consequence. Trevor Hale, whose father had funded Pendrix's second tower, was placed on indefinite leave pending review. That language was kind, more than he deserved, but Ava did not intervene to harden it. Let the system speak for itself. Let the recordings and witness statements tell the truth. She knew that humiliation never truly needed echo to be felt. It only needed clarity, and clarity had arrived. And yet Ava's attention turned elsewhere, not toward those who mocked her, but toward those who stood still when others did not. Malik, the intern who had folded a towel and left it without a word, was summoned to her office. When he entered, his hands visibly trembled, but Ava only offered him a seat and a new contract. "We're expanding compliance," she said, her voice calm. "You've got good instincts. I'd like you on the team." Malik didn't speak for a long second, then nodded, his eyes unsure whether they should water or not. In the facilities wing, the janitor who had paused in the hallway that first day, Mrs. Carol Rivers, 64, with joints stiff from years of invisible work, found a letter in her locker. It was hand-signed. A promotion to facilities supervisor, effective immediately, with a benefits package she hadn't dared dream of. There was no ceremony, no speech, just quiet justice placed gently in her path. Ava continued her restructuring without spectacle. Department heads were realigned, redundancies were reviewed, and a new code of conduct was issued. Not with cold corporate lingo, but with language that reflected Ava herself. Clear, grounded, human. One line stood out among the bullet points. Every action leaves a trace. Respect is the only legacy worth preserving. No one dared question who had written it. She never raised her voice, never called out the names that had mocked hers. Instead, she promoted those who had once stood small, an IT assistant who had offered her his seat in the cafeteria, a junior copywriter who had slid tissues across the table after the Coke incident without a word. Their names now appeared in the internal recognition email sent out weekly, simple, dignified, unembellished. What she understood, what few others did, was that redemption lived in example, not retaliation. The ones who had laughed the loudest now kept their heads low, not from fear but from awareness. Ava did not need to remind them of what they had done. They remembered without help. One afternoon, while reviewing vendor contracts, a quiet knock came at her glass door. It was Esther Rowe, who had not spoken much since the board announcement. She stepped inside, her heels clicking with grace, and set a folder on Ava's desk. "These are the ethics reports," she said, then paused. "But I brought something else." From the inside pocket of her blazer, she unfolded a small photograph, creased, worn at the edges. It was the original shot of Clarence Langston and Ava Pendrix, standing on the site where the Pendrix Tower would eventually rise. "They used to call him the gentleman builder," Esther said, "because he built without noise. You carry that same quiet." She didn't linger. She didn't need to. Ava sat for a long moment after she left, the photo resting gently on her desk. There was a deep ache in her chest, not of pain, but of something older, something like fulfillment. She had walked through their ridicule, their assumptions, their dismissal, and answered with structure, with truth, with grace, and perhaps most powerfully, with silence. On her last morning in Atlanta before returning to the parent office in Geneva, Ava Langston Pendrix stood alone on the rooftop of the Pendrix Systems Tower, the skyline stretching out around her in calm confidence, as if the city itself remembered who she was now. The wind lifted strands of her hair, now loosened from its usual tight bun, letting it fall gently across her shoulders like something she had finally permitted to be seen. She wasn't thinking of titles or reports or restructured departments. She was thinking of silence. Its weight, its usefulness, its consequence. She thought of her mother's voice in the evenings, reading aloud from Baldwin and Morrison and King, the kind of literature that didn't scream but still reverberated through a life. She thought of the soft gaze of Miss Rivers, the janitor turned supervisor, who had left a note on her desk that morning, "They see me now, thank you." Down below, the building moved on as if nothing had changed. Coffee brewed, emails pinged, printers hummed. But Ava knew better. Culture rarely shouted its shift. It whispered. It bent slightly, then all at once. You did not always see the moment it transformed. You only saw what followed. Ava Pendrix stepped onto the rooftop quietly, as he always had. Tall, composed, the type of man whose presence did not announce itself, but was always noticed. He didn't speak. He simply walked to her side and stood, their shoulders not touching but aligned. The way old trees grow toward the same sun without ever needing to lean on each other. Ava smiled, just barely, a curve that belonged more to memory than to reaction. "They asked me if I wanted a ceremony," she said after a while, "a retirement plaque for the old chairman, speeches, catered lunch, some branded pens." Isaiah chuckled softly, the sound deep and clean. "And me?" "I said no," she replied. "I think we've had enough noise." They stood together for a long while, watching the light spread across the buildings, the gentle rustle of the trees far below barely audible over the morning wind. Neither of them needed to say what had happened. It was written already. In contracts updated, in names lifted, in voices lowered with new respect. Inside the tower, a young designer who had once whispered at Ava's soaked blouse now carried a sketchbook under her arm and glanced at the name plaque outside the chairwoman's office with a kind of quiet reverence. Malik walked through the HR floor with a new badge and a posture no longer bent by hesitation. The laughter, once quick and unchecked, now lived only in memory, softened by time and its reckoning. Ava had left no trail of retribution, no tally of who had wronged her. What she left instead was a tone, a new standard. The kind of atmosphere that didn't ask for diversity reports because it lived inclusion daily, not performatively, where small kindnesses were noted not as exception but expectation, where dignity, once mocked, became the baseline. Before leaving, Ava stopped by the bulletin board outside the break room. The weekly employee notes of gratitude had a new slip pinned in fresh ink. To the woman who stood soaked and silent in the lobby and never wavered. You taught me more than any manager ever could. Anonymous. She read it once, then folded it carefully and tucked it beside the photo of her grandfather and Isaiah, the one Esther had given her. She didn't need to know who wrote it. The truth was in the writing. Later, at the airport, waiting at the gate with her simple black carry-on and a scarf wrapped loosely at her neck, Ava sipped coffee, black, no sugar, and watched the departure board flicker. A child nearby dropped a toy and she bent to pick it up, handing it back with a nod. The mother, surprised, thanked her, then squinted at her face, as if something seemed familiar. "Do I know you from somewhere?" the woman asked, polite, curious. Ava smiled again, that same restrained, knowing smile. "Probably not," she said softly. "But maybe you've heard what happens when a woman stands still long enough for people to see her." And with that she boarded the plane, the sun rising gently at her back, carrying no resentment, only the quiet power of having stood, endured, and changed the air around her forever.